Ms. Angelica, a Harvard Masters of Education graduate, is currently the Director of International Development for Lindamood Bell Center, that is the world leader in research and remediation for specific learning disabilities, including dyslexia and autism spectrum disorder. She served as project director in a randomized controlled study of dyslexic students at Georgetown University's Center for the Study of Learning that was featured in the August 2011 issue of NeuroImage. In addition to that, she has worked with numerous schools in the USA and the UK to implement Lindamood Bell research-validated instruction and school improvement models. Ladies and gentlemen, let us welcome Ms. Angelica Benson.
Thank you so much. It's a pleasure to be here and a true honor to be at the Dyslexia Association of Singapore. Thank you for the wonderful introduction as well. And I am from Lindamood Bell Learning Processes. I was just wondering of our group here, how many of you are familiar with Lindamood Bell and the work that we do? A couple of you are. Okay, wonderful. We're going to be talking today about the work from our organization. I was fortunate enough to start my early studies in children with learning difficulties and started working for Lindamood Bell over 20 years ago. And I'm excited to share with you how our organization has evolved over that amount of time. So our goal is to help every individual reach his or her potential to learn. We truly believe that every child can learn to their true potential. Our efforts as an organization include Lindamood Bell Learning Centers. In fact, we have a learning center here in Singapore that we'll be talking a little bit about. Many school partnerships in the US, in Jamaica, the Caribbean, Canada, among other places. Professional development workshops for teachers. We have a homeschool Lindamood Bell Academy that we offer, as well as an extensive amount of neurological and behavioral research. So Lindamood Bell was founded by Patricia Lindamood and Nancy Bell back in 1986. And Pat Lindamood started doing her early work in a hospital setting with children who weren't learning to read with the traditional reading-based programs at the time used in schools. Nancy is a reading specialist that started doing work with Pat. And from the very early start of their work together, they really believed they could make a true difference. They moved from the medical facility and developed their own programs and methodologies and created the first of our Lindamood Bell Learning Centers, which is based in the central coast of California, San Luis Obispo. That was, again, in 1986. Now we have about 70 learning centers across the US, the UK, Singapore, and Australia, which I'm very happy to report, as well as many other school partnerships. So for more than 30 years, we have worked with thousands of individuals of all ages and levels of learning challenges. Sitting across from a child or an adult struggling to read words or comprehend a paragraph provided us with a unique insight into the underlying sensory cognitive processes, which were the foundations for learning. Here are some of the questions that Pat and Nancy asked from the very beginning, and I want to ask you as an audience, if you also have had many of these same questions. So as a part of our journey, we questioned, we instructed, and we researched. Why could some children learn to read from an early age, but others could not? This is Pat Lindamood on the left, working with a student, actually. Why did some children decode below their potential, unable to catch up despite years of special education, reading programs, and/or private tutoring? Does that sound like many of the students that you work with? Curious? Thank you, great. Why did some individuals struggle to memorize sight words? Regardless of how many times we practiced them and reviewed them, why was it still difficult for them to have automaticity, the ability to recognize those quickly? Why did some read text easily, and this is Nancy Bell on the right, actually, yet struggle to comprehend what they read? And why were some still analytical readers rather than global readers at the end of phonological instruction? So what was the primary cause of dyslexia and of these difficulties that we observed? Could we identify a cause? And could we remediate that difficulty so that dyslexia would not be a lifelong learning struggle. So we learned that sensory input is the primary foundation for cognition and successful learning. After experience and scientific research, we've learned specifically that the input of imagery, which I'll be talking about today primarily, is the primary foundation for that language and learning process to take place. As Nancy Bell started doing her work and looking at the importance of imagery in developing language processing skills, we realized that our work mirrored the work of Alan Pavio, a cognitive psychologist who is the father of dual coding theory. So as much as we know reading programs change and evolve, we know that reading and spelling are cognitive acts, and we believe that any instructional program should therefore be based in what we know about cognitive theory. So Alan Pavio actually said that cognition is proportional to the extent that we have the ability to dual code language. So we take in two codes if we're good at language processing. One is a verbal code, or that's the language, and the secondary is a nonverbal code. And those two are critical for us to have cognition and communication and learning to take place. And he believed very much so that there were individual differences in individuals' ability to do that dual coding. As we began the work that we do around imagery, we've found that to resonate very much with the students that we see, imagery being that nonverbal code, if you will. And as a result, I'll be talking today with you. I'm hoping that you'll be thinking about ways that you in your own practice can be stimulating dual coding with students rather than just single coding. So Pat and Nancy identified these three sensory cognitive functions. You all are familiar with the first one, phonemic awareness. Pat was instrumental with Isabella Lieberman and many of the early thinkers in the field in the 1960s and 70s to look at and validate the importance of phonemic awareness, how well we can tell the number, identity, and order of sounds within words. Adding to that knowledge base, Nancy Bell has developed what we call and know as symbol imagery. We were finding that imaging was a critical piece to reading, and what type of imagery is symbols, and it's how well we can remember symbols in our mind's eye, and those symbols need to represent the sounds and the letters in words. So it turns out in our experience that that's actually a very critical piece to being an independent reader. And then finally, the third sensory cognitive function is concept imagery. That's how well we can create an imaged gestalt or a whole or a movie, if you will, for oral and written language in our mind's eye. Could you get me some water? I'm just feeling like, or actually I have a little water, I think, in my, thank you. Just feeling like that might suit me well. If you guys can just bear with me for one moment. And that was actually my colleague, Rosie, who's our center director here in our Singapore Learning Center. So just a little shout out to Rosie. We're both here and look forward to meeting many of you over the course of the conference. So Nancy Bell, out of her frustration of what was happening in the field of reading in the 1970s and 80s, developed what we call a Venn diagram or the reading circles. And it's her way of stressing the importance of integrating all of these key areas in our instructional practices when we're trying to develop language processing in students. Most importantly, when we look at these specific areas, she has mapped on where those sensory cognitive functions are most critical. The first area, of course, is the auditory area. That's where phonemic awareness lives. It's our ability to sound out nonsense words, how well we can phonologically process sounds in words. That would be our primary focus. Often in reading instruction, that's the single coding that we focus on and stress very heavily. It's often to the exclusion or the neglect sometimes of this visual circle, which relates to symbol imagery, how well you can visualize in your mind's eye those letters or those symbols. That relates to spelling, because of course a word like night NITE. We can't rely just on our phonemic processing to spell that. We have to have a way to internally access and remember the order of the symbols to spell it correctly. And for that matter, it could be KNIGHT or NIGHT, a little bit of further differentiation in our imagery and symbols to be able to determine which one we need to pick that would most appropriately match the word we need to spell. So we feel very strongly about the need and the importance of developing instructional processes that develop this specifically. It relates to word recognition, sight words, fluency, orthographic processing. And finally, we want to look at the language area, how well we can process single words, vocabulary words, to be able to comprehend. We know that vocabulary is a critical piece to developing reading, but we don't want to rely solely on teaching vocabulary as the way to access this big circle, the big red circle, which stands for, most importantly, comprehension, why we're teaching children to read in the first place. So all of these sub-skills need to be developed and assessed. We know we can do that very well now, but also we need to be mindful of the larger picture goal. This is our pipeline. We're looking at, in our organization, we see students as young as age 5 or 6, all the way up to adulthood. Often they come to us with a range of learning profiles and learning needs, dyslexia being one of them. We see children with autism and many other language-based difficulties. Typically, what happens is by the time these students hit 3rd grade in the US, they start to drift off that line. So they're not making a year of growth for a year of school anymore. And the research has shown if we can't get them caught up by 3rd or 4th grade, they just will continue that plateau, and as you can see, the gap gets wider and wider and wider. And it's not unusual for us in our organization to see children 15 years old, 16-year-olds that are reading at the level of a 7-year-old or an 8-year-old because that gap has grown so wide. And our goal in instruction is to close that gap and bring them back up onto that pipeline. So the question Pat and Nancy had is, what's really the underlying root cause? Is it relating to the quality of teachers in the classroom? Is it the curriculum? Is it students not attending? What's really the underlying piece that's making this pattern happen? And they believe very strongly that it's weak sensory cognitive functions, which in fact then creates difficulty with reading, spelling, communication, critical thinking skills, and writing. And that, in turn, curriculum-wide, is what makes it such a challenge and a struggle. So the PA is phonemic awareness, and then the CI and the SI are concept and symbol imagery. So this is what that imagery might look like, a word like short. And we actually test this skill by holding the word up on a card, like S-H-O-R-T, and we take the card away and we ask students, well, what letters did you see? And some students can very quickly remember the letters, the order, and they're very automatic in doing so. Other students have a very difficult time with this ability. As you can imagine, those that have difficulty in this area have a lot of difficulty then with recalling in the areas that I mentioned. There's our concept imagery, and it's making a fluid, vivid movie that matches the incoming language, whether it's oral or written in our mind's eye. And actually, Nancy went ahead and created this processing spectrum, if you will, where students, often they come to us with weaknesses actually in both types of imagery, but we often do see students that may have a strength in decoding and a weakness in comprehension. Anyway, there's a spectrum where we see students fall. Those that are on the more extreme ends typically need more instructional time to develop the underlying language processing needed. I'm actually going to tell you about Buzz, one of the students in our learning centers. He was 12 and came to us with a diagnosis of dyslexia. He spent many years in public education in the US, special education, had many programs to develop phonological processing. He was 12 and a half, 7th grade level. This is, of course, just our quick way of looking at interpreting test scores. Anything falling within the 25th to the 75th, of course, is looked at in the normal range, and anything at the 37th or below is really showing a significant gap or weakness. This is Buzz's profile, and we have thousands of Buzzes that we see in our organization every year, which is why we wanted to share this one. What's striking about his profile in blue is that he had great word attack skills. He had great phonemic awareness. He started to show some difficulty in word recognition, and then when we got him reading on the page, on the Gray Oral reading test, you can see his rate dropped pretty significantly to the 10th, and accuracy 25th, and fluency at the 16th. So he's actually well below that 25th percentile, moving down as he's reading in the page. Interestingly enough, his Peabody Picture Vocabulary Test, the top score, which is looking at receptive vocabulary, was quite high. So essentially, he could sound out words, but he couldn't read. And he had actually a really good way to guess at words because he had such a high vocabulary level. Does that sound like any of the students that you see? Just curious. And what's interesting is many of these students have had so much development in phonemic awareness. We see this sort of lopsided profile, and often the instructional response is, let's teach more phonics and phonemic awareness. And as you can see, we often still continue to have this imbalance in reading performance once we get them reading in context. So our goal is to really develop global readers that are not simply relying on sounding out words, but are able to focus on their visualization of symbols to build orthographic processing, getting that word recognition circle developed, and using that to become an independent reader. So these are symptoms of weak symbol imagery, and essentially, I'm stressing the word symptoms because we believe that that symbol imagery is what the underlying root cause is creating these difficulties. So some of these include word reading skills that are difficult, orthographic awareness, phonological awareness, memorizing sight words. Very, very commonly, students may remember a word, we learn it on one page, and we get to the word in the next page, and they don't recognize it anymore. And we have to sound out the word again and embed it in an automatic way. And we may find again that retention and ability to access that word, usually because it's the weak symbol imagery, is very impaired. So it's not uncommon for us to see that difficulty with accurate and quick decoding. It was interesting to hear Geetha this morning talk about the square root phenomenon. That's the first time I had heard that, but that certainly resonates with our work because there's such a difficulty getting accuracy as well as fluency and automaticity going for these students. Difficulty with contextual reading, a lot of guessing, and orthographic spelling. So they may spell night, N-I-T-E, because they do have some phonological awareness, but we're not getting them very easily to remember that night is N-I-G-H-T. Some of the transparency lacking in the English language can further complicate that if you're weak in symbol imagery. This is an opposite student, Natalie. She was in our London Learning Center. Her father called us and said, I'm beside myself. I have a daughter that's she's an 11-year-old in 6th grade. She's doing really well in her ability to sound out words, to spell, to remember words. Her oral vocabulary seems to be above the normal range, and her paragraph reading is at the 91st percentile in accuracy, but she can't follow directions very well. She rereads information, tries to memorize it, so her comprehension is really, really difficult. By 3rd grade, they were notified by the school that she wasn't attending, she wasn't completing tasks. By 5th grade, the same complaints continued, but they started to add on that she wasn't motivated, and of course, as many of our students, they don't want to come to school. And she told her parents she felt she was dumb. So when we did an assessment on her, and these are tests that essentially measure those circles, the component parts on the slide, as well as that big circle comprehension. The interior circles of the slide are all shaded in. As you can see, she has some really high scores in all of the decoding, spelling, word recognition, vocabulary, all of the component parts of reading are very well developed for her. But as you can see, and we would call her a hyperlexic student, typically in the US, which is students that have such a high level of decoding ability and a disproportionate, unexpected level of weakness in comprehension. She was at the 2nd percentile in comprehension. Does that sound like any of the students that you see? Just curious. Yep, and actually we see a lot of students with ASD, autism spectrum disorder. We see quite a many of them that come to us with a very similar profile. So what Nancy asked students early on, all those years ago, is what's happening? She asked students that could read and comprehend well, what's happening when you read? What are you doing differently? And they said, well, I make pictures in my mind. I make movies when I read. And the students that were struggling said, the words go in one, out one ear and the other, and they just don't stick. They don't stick. I can reread it and rehear it, but it's not happening. Let me go back for a minute, actually. So they're often getting parts and pieces, and their imagery may have some accurate details to it. So sometimes it may appear that they can understand and communicate and retain that information, but when we get to a higher level where they may have mood or some more subtleties involved in processing, that's where the parts don't fit together very well to get to the gestalt or the whole. And that makes it difficult for all the higher order thinking skills, getting a main idea, cause and effect relationship, predictions, conclusions, because that lack of imagery, concept imagery, is what's struggling, that words are going in one ear and out the other, and they're not sticking. So here are symptoms of weak concept imagery. These are the areas that we have assessed in the battery that I shared with you earlier. Written language comprehension, and most notably, oral language comprehension, which is often an area overlooked or assumed. We find students may be stronger in one or the other, so it's very important for us to assess both modalities. Critical thinking skills, following directions. Of course, if you're trying to comprehend directions, get out your math book, turn to page 5, and solve the first 3 problems. If you're hearing that in the class, all of those parts that need to be imaged and sequenced together can be very difficult. So the kids are hearing all this language going by, and they may be off task, and they may be asking their friend and modeling what's around them, and that's how they kind of go through their day, rather than having an internal way to really process that information. So we actually see a lot of kids that come to us with ADHD diagnoses, among other things, behavioral issues, but often it's they're not getting the language. So they are going to often be not following the oral directions, asking things to be repeated many, many times, struggling with critical thinking skills, and actually we find it spills over to understanding and grasping humor and jokes, social situations, mental mapping, among other things. All right, I wanted to share with you, now that we know how important these imagery abilities are, what kind of an impact could we make if we actually are able to develop those areas? This is Learning Center students from, now we have almost 70 learning centers. This is looking back over the last 10 years. We had actually 23,000 students as a whole in this pool, and the blue shaded area is our decoding week students. So those students really struggled with symbol imagery. We have almost 9,500 students in that specific area, and I wanted to start with that specific population and share with you, and we'll move through here. But what did we do? Well, we used a program called Seeing Stars, and it's a way to explicitly target and develop this imagery ability so that we can see it and we apply it over to word attack, word recognition, and reading. We actually have a whole lot of slides that are in the online slides. I wanted to abbreviate a little bit today, but you can actually see a little bit more about how the process looks. There's a lot of Socratic language, and we're asking students, what did you picture, what did you see in your mind's eye? We often start with nonsense words because they may know real words, so we're not able to actually help develop that imagery ability. I will say that Nancy Bell has developed a test for symbol imagery, and it's been normed in the United States, and it's something that we use as a part of our assessment battery. And I have data, we've seen it's actually more highly correlated with reading, thanks, I'm running short of time, than phonemic awareness and rapid automatized naming, among other things. So symbol imagery is the testing on the left. Then we have phonemic awareness, word attack, word rec, accuracy, and comprehension. And those are pre- and post-test scores for students that had about 100 hours of instruction. They were on average age 9.5. This is almost 8,000 students. What I want you to notice is how many of them we were able to get into that golden range between the 25th to the 50th percentile or above. That's really our target. So we saw some significant gains in all areas. And actually, when we looked at how significant those standard score changes were in each area, there were very large standard score changes as well. We have many students that have a prior diagnosis of dyslexia, and I wanted to just share really quickly, there's 1,700 students. Most, you can see, have a little bit more difficulty than the prior group. We saw really significant changes, most notably you can see in simple imagery across the board. And those are the average standard score changes. You can see these in our online slides. I actually have a little bit more data that I put in the slides for you. And then for students that have concept imagery weaknesses, like Natalie, we develop imagery from the smallest meaningful unit of language, a single word, and we scale that ability up to a whole sentence, multiple sentences, a whole paragraph, paragraph by paragraph, and we have a whole scope and sequence to do that. So many students we see can image a single sentence, but when you give them multiple sentences, that's really where the difficulty lies. So this is 5,000 Natalie's. Their pre and post scores after about 98 hours, which is on average what our students typically receive. So that's comprehension, oral directions, word opposites, and vocabulary. I want to move through this so I can get to, and here's the standard score changes. I wanted to share with you our latest dyslexia research out of the University of Washington. We now have 3 peer-reviewed papers, and I know there actually are a couple more on the way. This was done with Dr. Jason Yateman, who's very big in the field of reading dyslexia at his neuroscience lab in Seattle, and he invited our organization to provide intervention because he wanted to measure what happened in the brains of dyslexic children as they acquired reading ability. So they actually went to his lab and got neuroimaging. They got fMRIs and diffusion sensor tensor imaging, a couple of different measures, and a battery of reading measures. Then they came to our learning centers and got a lot of stimulation in simple imagery and reading, and they went back into the lab at little intervals all the way throughout the study, and then had a thorough battery at the end. So this is just a tiny little snapshot of what they were able to find. And he was actually very astounded because he wasn't expecting to see such a significant change neurologically. But what he found is that white matter tracts and what is known as the reading network in the brain developed, and it was actually correlated with the number of hours of instruction that students have. So it was rapid and widespread myelination of that white matter network of the reading area in the brain. There's a little bit more there. Again, these are in the slides. So the reading skills also in the study improved by an average of 1 full grade level after 8 weeks of instruction. And you can read online as well about our neurological changes. We did a study with Georgetown University about 10 years prior. It was with a pediatric dyslexic population, and we used students at a private school for dyslexics in Baltimore, Maryland. And I just wanted to share with you quickly, they did all of the assessments and fMRIs of students, and they invited our organization to provide the intervention. There were actually significant changes in reading, but there were also 4 areas of the brain that had increased volume. There were gray matter, changes in gray matter. And those lines on this slide are showing you pre-post measures, the T1 and T2, and the changes in those 4 areas of the brain, which are associated with episodic memory, comprehension, reading. After that, there was a null period, and they wanted to see did those changes maintain themselves neurologically. And Jason Yateman has actually done the same thing. He's had a time point further out from intervention and has seen very similarly that those gains neurologically and changes did maintain. So I just wanted to quickly show, and I have to wrap up, I'm being told. So imagery language instruction results in significant improvement in language and literacy skills. And we know that it is possible to identify strengths and weaknesses in these areas, and once they're identified, we can develop them to teach a child to read and comprehend. And we've seen actually a similar study with ASD students who have had fMRI work out of the University of Alabama, Birmingham, which is also in your slides. So we have seen significant changes behaviorally and neurologically with these students. And I'm going to end with a quote from Nancy Bell. If we measure the sensory cognitive processing, differentiate the diagnosis, and provide instruction to develop the sensory input of imagery, students can become independent in language and literacy skills. It is inaccurate to suggest that a reading disability is a lifelong handicap that cannot be changed and cured. If the brain can change, the behaviors can change. And I just wanted to end saying thank you. We actually are going to be sharing some of the research today in our poster session in the lunchtime hour. So I would love to talk further with you and see you there. All right. Thank you.